thought Black Americans were not capable of building anything of their own. Not a city, not an economy, not a culture powerful enough to reach beyond its own borders. For generations, that was the quiet assumption baked into American law and American life. Keep Black communities scattered, keep them poor, keep them policed into silence, and they would never assemble into anything the country would have to reckon with. No banks, no press, no movement. Just isolated families, isolated churches, isolated towns, easy to ignore and easier to control. They were wrong. And the proof of exactly how wrong sits on 3 square miles of Manhattan Island, a neighborhood the FBI placed under active surveillance for decades, that the New York Police Department assigned a special unit to monitor, not for crime, but for sermons and poetry readings that officials found too dangerous to ignore. In a single generation, the very people white America had written off built more Black-owned newspapers, more Black millionaires, and more Black political power than had ever existed in one place in the history of the country. They did it with almost nothing, and they did it in a city that never intended to let them. This is the story of how Harlem became the capital of Black America, whether America wanted it to or not. And it starts, like most great migrations do, with one person deciding they had nothing left to lose by leaving. Imagine yourself standing on a train platform in Savannah, Georgia, in the spring of 1917. A woman named Odessa is holding a cardboard suitcase tied shut with rope. Inside it is everything she owns. Beside her, 3 children stare at a steam engine they have never seen up close before. Her husband is not with her. He left 2 months ago, and she has not heard from him since. She does not know if he is alive. She does not know if there will be work waiting, or a room, or a bed. All she knows is a rumor, whispered on porches and shouted from pulpits, passed hand to hand in the pages of a newspaper smuggled north on freight cars because Southern postmasters refused to deliver it. The rumor has a name, Harlem. She has never seen it. She cannot picture its streets, but she has heard that in Harlem, a Black man can rent an apartment with real windows. She has heard that a Black woman can walk past a police officer without lowering her eyes. She has heard that no one will drag her son into a field at gunpoint over a debt he never agreed to. So she boards the train, not knowing if any of it is true, only knowing that the alternative, staying, has already killed people she loved. Within a decade, more than 1 million people will make the exact same decision she is making right now. And together, without planning it, without a single leader coordinating it, they will build something no one has ever seen in the history of the United States. A Black capital in the middle of the whitest, richest city on earth. This is the story of how that happened. This is the story of how a strip of farmland on the northern tip of Manhattan Island became the political, cultural, and intellectual heart of Black America. It is a story with heroes, and it is a story with villains. And by the end of it, you will understand why the FBI opened files on Harlem's poets, why the New York Police Department created an entire unit just to watch its churches, and why, for one extraordinary stretch of the 20th century, everyone from Paris to Moscow understood that if you wanted to know what Black America was thinking, you did not go to Washington. You went to Harlem. Let's go back further than most people expect, because Harlem's story does not begin with the people who made it famous. It begins with the people who accidentally built it for them, and then tried to take it back. In the final years of the 19th century, Harlem was a fashionable white neighborhood. Brownstones lined its streets, built for bankers and merchants who wanted distance from the crowding of downtown Manhattan. Developers had bet enormous sums on Harlem's future, certain that as the city's elevated railways pushed north, the neighborhood would fill with wealthy families for generations to come. For a while, it did. Then, in the first years of the new century, the bet collapsed. Real estate speculators had overbuilt. There were more apartments than there were white tenants willing to fill them. Landlords who had sunk their fortunes into Harlem brownstones now faced buildings standing half empty, their mortgages coming due whether or not anyone was paying rent. This is the moment history turns on a hinge that almost no one saw coming. A black real estate broker named Philip Payton looked at those empty buildings and made an offer no one expected. He proposed to landlords that he would fill their vacant apartments, guarantee the rent, and take a commission if they would rent to black tenants. Understand what this meant in 1904. Renting to a black family in a white apartment building was not simply unusual. In much of the city, it was treated as a scandal, sometimes even provoking legal threats from neighbors and boycotts from other landlords. But desperate landlords, staring at empty buildings and mounting debt, took the deal anyway. Payton filled one building, then another. White tenants, furious, began to move out rather than share a building with black neighbors, which only created more vacancies, which Payton filled again. Some white property owners, in a panic, organized what they literally called anti-invasion associations, raising money to buy out black tenants and keep the neighborhood white. They failed. They failed because the economics were already moving in one direction, and no amount of outrage could reverse a landlord's mortgage payment. By 1910, block by block, Harlem was becoming something its original builders had never intended. It was becoming black. And here's what almost no one in New York understood yet, what would not become clear for another decade. They had accidentally built exactly the kind of neighborhood that made possible what came next. Wide boulevards, solid, handsome brownstones with running water and real staircases, not the cramped, disease-ridden tenements black New Yorkers had been confined to for decades in the Tenderloin district downtown. Churches with room to hold thousands, and critically, a geography large enough and now available enough to receive not hundreds of new residents, but hundreds of thousands. Because at the exact moment Harlem's doors were creaking open, the American South was manufacturing a reason for black families to walk through them. Let's pause here and be precise about what was happening below the Mason-Dixon line, because sanitized versions of this story tend to soften it, and the softened version does not explain why 6 million people uprooted their entire lives. The Jim Crow South was not simply a place of inconvenient segregation. It was a system engineered to trap black labor in place through law, debt, and terror. Sharecropping contracts were structured so that a family could work a field for an entire year and end the season owing more than when they started. Vagrancy laws allowed police to arrest any black man who could not immediately prove employment, and then lease his labor to plantations or mines through convict leasing, a system historians have rightly called slavery by another name. And hanging over all of it, enforced not by courts but by mobs, was lynching. Between 1900 and 1920 alone, hundreds of black Americans were murdered by white crowds, often for imagined offenses, often with law enforcement standing by and doing nothing, sometimes with law enforcement leading the mob itself. Then, in 1914, a war broke out in Europe that would tear this entire system open. As American factories rushed to supply the Allied war effort, and as the flow of European immigrants who had traditionally filled northern factory jobs slowed to almost nothing, northern industrialists suddenly needed workers. Desperately. Railroad companies, steel mills, and meatpacking plants in cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit began actively recruiting black Southern labor, sometimes sending agents south in person, sometimes simply publishing job listings in newspapers like the Chicago Defender, which was smuggled into the South by Pullman porters because white postmasters would destroy it on sight if they found it. For the first time in the history of the Black South, there was somewhere else to go, and someone on the other end who actually wanted them to arrive. The result was not a trickle, it was a flood. Historians now call it the Great Migration, and the numbers are almost impossible to hold in your head at once. Between 1916 and 1970, roughly 6 million Black Americans left the South. This was not a single event. It was a slow-motion earthquake that lasted more than half a century, and its first and most concentrated tremors landed squarely on Harlem. By 1920, Harlem's Black population had grown past 150,000. By 1930, it would exceed 200,000, packed into roughly 3 square miles. To put that in perspective, more Black people were now living in this single Manhattan neighborhood than in most entire American cities. And they did not arrive as a blank population waiting to be shaped. They arrived as doctors and dock workers, as preachers and pickpockets, as sharecroppers' daughters who had taught themselves to read by kerosene lamp, and as college-trained intellectuals from Fisk and Howard University, who saw in Harlem something the South had never once allowed them, a place to simply exist, ambitiously, publicly, without asking permission. They also did not arrive alone. The Great Migration out of the American South was joined, in these same years, by a second wave that history often overlooks. Black immigrants from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and beyond, fleeing their own colonial economies and drawn by the same rumor of opportunity. By the 1920s, an estimated 1 in 4 Harlem residents had been born outside the United States entirely. This collision of Southern migrants and Caribbean immigrants, of the deeply religious and the fiercely radical, of sharecroppers and socialists, of Baptist preachers and Black nationalists, is what made Harlem combustible in the best and most dangerous senses of that word. It was not one community. It was dozens of communities stacked on top of each other in 3 square miles of Manhattan, all of them arriving at roughly the same conclusion at roughly the same time, that they were done waiting for permission, and that here, finally, they had room to build something of their own. Let's return to Odessa, because her story does not end on that Savannah platform, and neither does this one. She rides north for 2 days and 2 nights, sitting in the segregated car at the front of the train, closest to the engine, closest to the smoke and the soot, because that is where the conductor tells her she belongs, even this far from Georgia. Somewhere around Washington, the car is uncoupled and the segregation quietly ends. Not because anyone announces a change of heart, but because the law simply stops requiring it north of that line. She notices the strangeness of it. No one tells her she can now sit anywhere she likes. She simply notices, slowly, that no one is watching her the way they watched her at home. When she finally steps off the train at Pennsylvania Station and makes her way uptown, what she finds is not the promised land of rumor. It is something stranger and more complicated than that. She finds rooming houses charging Black tenants nearly double what white tenants paid for the same rooms downtown, because landlords understood exactly how few other options existed and priced accordingly. She finds families crowding 4 and 5 to a room just to split the rent. She finds, within her first week, a woman on a stoop who has never met her offering to mind her children while she looks for work, because that is simply what Harlem does for the newly arrived. She finds a Black-owned bank on 135th Street. She finds a church with a choir so large it fills an entire balcony. She finds, on a Sunday afternoon, an entire block closed off so people can dance in the street to a new kind of music called jazz. And for one afternoon, no policeman comes to disperse the crowd. Harlem was not paradise. It was expensive and crowded and unequal in its own particular ways. But it was theirs, in a way nothing in Georgia had ever been. And that difference, subtle as it might sound from the outside, is the entire reason 6 million people made the same journey after her. What they built next would terrify the New York Police Department, inspire a literary movement that reshaped American culture, produce some of the wealthiest Black entrepreneurs in the nation's history, and draw the direct, obsessive attention of J. Edgar Hoover himself. Churches with congregations in the thousands would rise on 138th Street. A newspaper empire would take root that white America could not control and increasingly could not ignore. And a woman born to formerly enslaved parents in Louisiana would become, through nothing but a hair care formula and an iron will, the first self-made female millionaire in American history of any race. But none of that happens without understanding one more thing first. Something Odessa standing on that Savannah platform could not have known. Harlem was not simply going to be a refuge. It was about to become the single most surveilled, most contested, most fiercely defended 3 square miles in the entire country. Because the moment Black America built a capital, powerful people who had never once worried about a scattered, divided Black population suddenly had to reckon with what happened when that population had a center, a place to organize, a place to publish, a place to vote as a bloc, worship as a bloc, and eventually refuse as a bloc. That is where we go next. In part 2, we step off the train alongside the migrants themselves into a Harlem transforming in real time, and we meet the woman who would become the first Black female millionaire in American history. The newspaper editor the federal government considered dangerous enough to investigate as a threat to national security, and the church on Odell Clark Place that could hold more worshipers on a Sunday morning than some southern towns held residents. The rumor that pulled Odessa north was about to become real, and it was about to become far bigger and far more dangerous to the people who preferred Black America stay scattered than anyone standing on that Savannah platform could have imagined. They said a woman born in a sharecropper's cabin in Louisiana, orphaned by the time she was 7, widowed by 20, with no formal schooling past the 3rd grade, could not become one of the wealthiest self-made women in the entire country. They were not simply wrong. She would prove them wrong so completely that by the time she died, her name would be etched onto the map of Harlem itself, on a mansion overlooking the Hudson, and a headquarters building on 136th Street that trained thousands of Black women in a trade no one else would teach them. Her name was Madam C.J. Walker, and her story is where Harlem's transformation from a refuge into a capital truly begins. When we left off, Harlem's population had exploded past 200,000, arriving from Georgia and South Carolina, from Jamaica and Barbados, packed into 3 square miles of brownstones that white developers had built for tenants who never came. But a place does not become a capital simply by filling up with people. A capital needs institutions. It needs money that stays inside the community instead of draining out of it. It needs a press that can tell its own story instead of waiting for someone else to tell it wrong. And it needs a spiritual center loud enough and large enough to hold a people together through everything that was still coming for them. In the years just before and after 1920, Harlem built all 3, almost at once, and the people who built them would not be able to stay quiet, hidden, or ignored, no matter how badly certain powerful men in Washington wanted them to. Let's start with the money, because Madam Walker's story is not simply a rags to riches tale. It is the story of how Black economic power took physical shape in Harlem for the first time. Sarah Breedlove, the woman the world would come to know as Madam C.J. Walker, spent her 20s working as a laundress in St. Louis, earning barely more than $1 a day scrubbing other people's clothes on her knees. In her 30s, struggling with her own hair loss, a common problem among Black women subjected to harsh soaps and lye-based treatments with no products designed for their hair at all, she began experimenting with her own formula of ointments and scalp treatments. What she built from that kitchen experiment became an empire. By the 1910s, Madam Walker's company employed an estimated 20,000 Black women as sales agents across the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America. Women who went door to door demonstrating her products and, just as importantly, earning independent incomes for the first time in their lives, free from the domestic and agricultural labor that had trapped their mothers. In 1916, Walker moved her business headquarters to Harlem, and the timing was not an accident. She wanted her company at the center of the largest concentration of black consumers, black talent, and black ambition in the country. And by then, that center was unmistakably Harlem. She built a townhouse on 136th Street that doubled as a training school, and a lavish estate up the Hudson in Irvington, New York, called Villa Lawaro, designed by one of the only licensed black architects in the country at the time. When she died in 1919, newspapers across the country, including some run by white editors who had spent years dismissing black economic ambition entirely, were forced to report what the numbers plainly showed. She had left behind a fortune, making her, by any honest measure, the first self-made female millionaire in American history of any race. And she had done it selling a product to a population everyone else in American business had decided was not worth manufacturing for. Walker's success was not an isolated miracle. It was proof of concept, and Harlem's black entrepreneurs took note. Banks like the Dunbar National Bank opened on 150th Street, specifically to serve customers that downtown banks refused to lend to. Insurance companies, funeral homes, and real estate firms followed the same logic Philip Payton had discovered a decade earlier. Wherever white businesses refused to serve black customers, or refused to serve them with dignity, there was an opening for black businesses to fill it, and Harlem's density meant that opening was enormous. Consider what Walker's headquarters on 136th Street actually meant to the women who walked through its doors. Her company did not simply sell hair products. It trained thousands of black women as licensed beauticians and independent sales agents through what she called Walker agents, giving them a trade, an income, and a title, at a time when the only work most cities offered a black woman was domestic service in a white household for wages that rarely covered rent. Walker herself insisted her agents present themselves with dignity, holding conventions where she awarded prizes not just for sales figures, but for community service and charitable giving, because she understood, correctly, that an economy built only on individual profit would not hold a neighborhood together the way one built on mutual obligation would. By the time of her death in 1919, she had also become one of the largest single donors to the NAACP's anti-lynching campaign, proof that Harlem's new wealth was not staying quietly in private bank accounts. It was being redirected, deliberately, into the fight for the rest of Black America still living under the exact conditions Odessa had fled in Part 1. But money alone does not build a capital. A capital needs a voice. And here is where the story turns dangerous, because the voice Harlem built frightened the federal government badly enough that they opened files on it. Let's talk about the black press. The Amsterdam News had been founded in Harlem back in 1909, but it was in the years surrounding the First World War that Harlem's newspapers became something closer to a weapon. Consider a publication called The Messenger, founded in 1917 by two young radicals, A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen, socialists who used its pages to argue for black labor organizing, anti-lynching legislation, and, during the First World War, outright opposition to black soldiers dying for a democracy that denied them basic rights at home. That last position did not sit well with the United States government. In 1919, the Department of Justice's own internal report on what officials called radical black publications singled out The Messenger by name, describing it in language that essentially labeled it the single most dangerous of all the periodicals aimed at black readers in the entire country. Randolph and Owen were investigated. Their mail was monitored. And still, The Messenger kept publishing, because Harlem, unlike a black newspaper operating alone in a small southern town, had the population density, the advertising base, and the sheer defiant readership to survive federal scrutiny that would have crushed a smaller operation instantly. This was the pattern that would define Harlem for the next several decades, and it is worth sitting with, because it explains everything that follows in this series. Scattered across the rural South, a radical newspaper could be burned out, its editor run out of town, or worse, in a single night, with no one outside the county ever hearing about it. Concentrated in Harlem, that same newspaper had readers by the tens of thousands, a base of black-owned printing presses and black-owned distribution networks, and enough political visibility that even a hostile federal government had to resort to surveillance and investigation rather than simple destruction. Density was protection. That is the quiet, structural reason Harlem became dangerous to the people who preferred Black America stay scattered. It was not simply that Harlem produced radicals. Small towns produced radicals too. It was that Harlem was large enough to keep them alive. There was a fourth pillar rising alongside the money, the press, and the pulpit, quieter than the others, but in some ways the most radical of all: memory itself. In 1925, the New York Public Library's 135th Street branch, sitting in the heart of Harlem, acquired the personal collection of a Puerto Rican-born black scholar named Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. Schomburg had spent decades of his own money and his own time doing something no major American institution had bothered to do before him. He collected manuscripts, rare books, letters, and artifacts documenting Black achievement across centuries and across continents. Evidence that a teacher in Puerto Rico had once told him did not exist. That Black people, in his teacher's words, had no history worth telling. Schomburg spent the rest of his life proving that teacher catastrophically wrong. And when his collection moved into that Harlem Library branch, it gave the neighborhood something no other Black community in America possessed at that scale: a physical, permanent archive of its own past, sitting on public shelves, available to anyone who walked through the door. Within years, that library branch would become a second home to nearly every writer and scholar who defined the era to come. The place where a new generation of Black intellectuals went to prove, with primary sources in hand, exactly how deep their history actually ran. Today, that collection anchors what is known as the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and historians still describe Harlem in these years the way the library itself came to understand it. Not simply as a neighborhood, but as a crossroads, where migrants from the American South, immigrants from the Caribbean, and the scattered written record of Africa and the Black diaspora all converged in one place for the first time in American history. And then there was the third pillar, the one that had existed the longest and would, in some ways, outlast all the others: the church. Picture Abyssinian Baptist Church in the early 1920s, under the leadership of a pastor named Adam Clayton Powell Sr. When Powell arrived at Abyssinian, it was already one of the oldest Black congregations in New York City, founded a century earlier by Black worshipers who had walked out of a downtown church rather than accept the humiliating seating arrangements forced on them. But Powell had a larger vision. In 1923, he moved the congregation into a new building on 138th Street, a neo-Gothic structure with soaring stone arches and seating for over 2,000 worshipers at a single service. On any given Sunday, the sidewalk outside would be crowded with people who could not fit inside, listening through open windows. Abyssinian was not merely a place of worship. It ran a soup kitchen, an employment bureau connecting new arrivals with jobs, and organized boycotts against downtown businesses that took Black customers' money on 125th Street while refusing to hire Black employees behind the counter. When Powell's son, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., later took the pulpit himself, he would use that same platform to launch one of the most consequential political careers of any Black American of the 20th century, eventually becoming the first Black congressman elected from New York State. That path began in a church pew on 138th Street, because the church was where Harlem's population, its money, and its political will all physically gathered in one room every single week. By the early 1920s then, look at what had assembled in this single Manhattan neighborhood in barely a decade. A population larger than most American cities. A press willing to say things no Southern Black newspaper had ever dared print, and large enough to survive the federal government's attempts to silence it. Churches with the size and organizational muscle to function as employment agencies, relief networks, and political machines all at once. And an economic engine led by figures like Madam Walker, proving that black consumers, treated seriously, represented a fortune waiting to be built. This is precisely why, when we get to part 3 of this story, you will see federal agents and city officials begin treating a neighborhood of poets and painters as though it were a national security threat. Because what Harlem had assembled by 1922 was not merely a cultural curiosity for downtown white New Yorkers to visit on a Saturday night, though many of them certainly did. It was, in every meaningful sense, an independent center of black economic, political, and spiritual power, operating inside the largest city in the United States. And it was about to produce an explosion of art, music, and literature so significant that the entire country and much of Europe would be forced to call it by name, the Harlem Renaissance. That explosion is where we go next, and it begins, fittingly, with a single poem, and a young writer named Langston Hughes stepping off a boat in New York Harbor, about to walk directly into the middle of everything Harlem had already built for him without his ever knowing it was there. They thought black artists had nothing original to offer American culture, nothing that white publishers, white critics, or white audiences would ever take seriously on its own terms. For decades, the publishing houses of New York had treated black writers, when they published them at all, as a novelty act, a curiosity to be printed once and quietly forgotten. They were wrong, so completely and so publicly wrong that within the span of about 10 years, a movement born in a few square miles of uptown Manhattan would force the entire country and a good portion of Europe to recognize a body of American literature, music, and art unlike anything that had come before it. Today, we call it the Harlem Renaissance. At the time, the people living through it had a simpler name for themselves. They called it the New Negro Movement, and the man who gave it that name understood exactly what he was declaring. When we left off, Harlem had spent roughly a decade building the infrastructure of power. Madam Walker's fortune, a press willing to defy the federal government, a church large enough to function as a political machine, and an archive proving black history stretched back centuries further than anyone downtown wanted to admit. By 1925, all of that infrastructure was about to produce something even its builders had not fully anticipated. Because once you give a population money, a voice, a pulpit, and a library, eventually someone picks up a pen, or a horn, or a paintbrush, and starts telling the world exactly who they are, on their own terms, for the first time. Let's start with that name. In 1925, a Howard University philosophy professor named Alain Locke published an anthology titled The New Negro, a collection of essays, poetry, and fiction by dozens of black writers, framed by Locke's own argument that a fundamental shift had taken place in black American identity. The old Negro, Locke wrote, had been a problem to be discussed, a figure defined entirely by white society's anxieties and assumptions. The new Negro would define himself. Locke's anthology was not simply a book, it was a manifesto, and it landed at the exact moment Harlem had assembled every ingredient necessary to prove the argument correct. Consider the writers Locke was introducing to a national audience. A young poet named Langston Hughes had arrived in Harlem in 1921, stepping off a boat from Mexico with almost no money and a manuscript of poems written in a voice no one had used in serious American poetry before. Cadences borrowed directly from blues and jazz, from the rhythms of black church services and black street corners, rendered without apology or translation for a white reader. His poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, written when Hughes was barely 18 years old, would become one of the most anthologized poems in American literature. Consider Zora Neale Hurston, trained as an anthropologist at Barnard College, who spent her early Harlem years collecting Southern black folklore with the same rigor a scholar might apply to any ancient civilization. insisting that the language and stories of rural Black America were not something to be embarrassed by, but a body of literature as sophisticated as anything taught in a university seminar. Consider Claude McKay, a Jamaican immigrant whose sonnet, "If We Must Die," written in direct response to a wave of white mob violence against Black communities in the summer of 1919, was so defiant in its refusal to accept victimhood that Winston Churchill himself would later quote it during the Second World War, almost certainly without knowing, or perhaps without caring, that its author was a Black immigrant radical living in Harlem. These writers did not simply publish quietly and hope to be noticed. They gathered, argued, competed, and collaborated in specific rooms you could have walked into. Picture 136th Street in the townhouse Madam Walker's daughter, Alelia Walker, had inherited and transformed into a salon she called the Dark Tower, named after a line of Count T. Cullen's poetry. On any given evening, you might find Hughes debating Cullen over the direction of Black poetry, painters like Aaron Douglas sketching on napkins, and touring European aristocrats sitting awkwardly in the corner, invited by Alelia herself, who had a genuine gift for making Harlem's Black intellectual elite and the visiting white curious collide in the same room, whether either group entirely wanted to or not. That collision is worth pausing on, because it was not always comfortable, and pretending it was would be dishonest to what actually happened. Let's talk about the Cotton Club on 142nd Street, because it captures the central contradiction of this entire era in a single building. Inside, some of the greatest Black musical talent in American history performed nightly. Duke Ellington led his orchestra there for years, developing the sound that would make him one of the most significant composers in American music. Cab Calloway would take over that same bandstand and turn scat singing into a national phenomenon. And yet, for most of its existence, the Cotton Club enforced a whites-only policy in its audience. Black Harlem could provide the genius on stage. Black Harlem was, for years, not permitted to sit in the seats and watch it. Read that back and sit with what it means. The single most famous nightclub associated with Harlem's cultural explosion in the popular imagination of white America at the time was a room where Black artistry was consumed, but Black patrons were barred at the door. This tension did not go unnoticed by the artists themselves, and it produced one of the sharpest debates of the entire Renaissance. In 1926, Langston Hughes published an essay titled "The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain," a direct response to Black intellectuals, including the towering scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, who worried that Black artists were tailoring their work to please white patrons and white audiences, softening or exaggerating Black life into whatever version sold best downtown. Hughes's answer was uncompromising. Black artists, he argued, had an obligation to express themselves honestly, in their own idiom, whether white audiences approved or not, and whether it made money or not. That same year, a white novelist named Carl Van Vechten, a fixture of Harlem's nightlife and a genuine patron of several Black writers, published a novel titled "Nigger Heaven," using a slur in its very title to describe Harlem, framing the neighborhood through a lens of white fascination with vice and exoticism that infuriated large parts of the Black literary community, even as some of the very writers Van Vechten had personally supported, including Hughes himself, defended aspects of the book. There was no single, unified Black opinion on any of this. That disagreement, argued out loudly in Harlem's own newspapers and salons, was itself proof of exactly what Locke had promised. A new Negro confident enough to argue in public on his own terms rather than present a single flattened face to white America. It is worth noting that the Cotton Club's whites-only door was not the only model uptown, and Harlem itself pushed back against it directly. A few blocks away, on Lenox Avenue, the Savoy Ballroom opened in 1926 with an explicit, deliberate policy of the opposite kind. An integrated dance floor, open to Black and white patrons alike, at a time when almost no other major venue in New York City allowed the two to dance in the same room. The Savoy's house band battles became legendary, and the Lindy Hop, a dance style born on that very floor, would eventually spread from Harlem to ballrooms across the entire country. The contrast between the Savoy and the Cotton Club, one block apart in practice, but a world apart in policy, is itself a small map of Harlem's larger argument with the rest of New York during these years. Black Harlem was not simply tolerating white curiosity from the outside. In places like the Savoy, it was setting the terms on which that curiosity would be allowed inside. The explosion was not confined to words and music either. Consider the sculptor Augusta Savage, who arrived in Harlem with almost no money and was initially rejected from a summer art program in France, specifically because American organizers feared white Southern students in the group would refuse to travel alongside her. Savage turned that rejection into a public controversy and eventually into a career, opening her own studio in Harlem where she taught sculpture to neighborhood children for free, several of whom would go on to become significant artists themselves. Consider Aaron Douglas, whose angular, silhouette-based paintings, drawing consciously on Egyptian and West African visual traditions rather than European ones, illustrated the covers of Locke's anthology and Hughes's poetry collections alike, giving the entire movement a visual identity as distinct as its literary one. These were not artists working in isolation, each producing their own separate output. They shared studios, illustrated each other's books, argued in the same salons, and collectively built something that functioned less like a scattered collection of talented individuals and more like an actual movement with its own aesthetic principles, debated and refined in public. Meanwhile, on the streets below these salons and nightclubs, an entirely different, more democratic version of this same cultural explosion was happening every single weekend. In apartments most of Harlem could actually afford to enter. Rent parties. Picture a Saturday night in a cramped Harlem apartment, furniture pushed against the walls, a hand-lettered sign taped near the entrance, advertising a small admission fee, 25 cents, maybe 50. Inside, a piano player, often someone who would go on to real fame, playing a style of driving, percussive piano called stride, while dozens of guests packed into rooms built for a fraction of that number, dancing, drinking home-brewed liquor during Prohibition, and eating fried fish and chicken sold by the plate. The purpose was not simply a good time, though it was certainly that. Rent in Harlem, as Odessa discovered when she first arrived in Part 1, ran significantly higher than comparable apartments downtown, because landlords understood exactly how limited black tenants' housing options remained. A single bad month could mean eviction. Rent parties were survival, dressed up as celebration, and they doubled as an entirely informal, entirely black-run music education system, where a teenager could stand in a crowded hallway and absorb piano technique from a master for the price of a quarter and a plate of chicken. Some of the biggest names in American music learned their craft in exactly these rooms. A young pianist named Thomas Fats Waller, before he became one of the most famous performers in the country, played rent parties across Harlem, sometimes several in a single night, moving from one crowded apartment to the next with nothing more than his hands and his reputation. James P. Johnson, often credited as the father of the stride piano style itself, did the same. And it was in these unglamorous, overcrowded living rooms, not in any concert hall, that the technical foundations of what would become swing and, eventually, bebop were first hammered out in public, night after night, in front of an audience that could not have afforded a ticket to hear the same music performed downtown. By the late 1920s, this entire ecosystem, the salons, the nightclubs, the rent parties, the poetry, had made Harlem impossible for the rest of the country to ignore. White tourists rode the subway uptown by the thousands on weekend nights specifically to experience it. European visitors compared Harlem's cultural output favorably to Paris, and a black population that white America had spent generations insisting had nothing of value to contribute to national culture had, within a single decade, produced poetry quoted by a future British Prime Minister, a musical innovator in Duke Ellington, whose influence would echo through the rest of the century, and a literary debate sophisticated enough to occupy the era's sharpest minds on both sides of the color line. But here's what almost none of the white tourists riding that subway uptown on a Saturday night understood, and what we need to sit with as we move into part 4. Not everyone in Harlem believed that poetry and jazz were the path forward. While Hughes was writing verse and Ellington was composing at the Cotton Club, a very different kind of gathering was filling the streets of Harlem with a very different kind of energy. Uniformed marchers, thousands of them, parading down Lenox Avenue behind a Jamaican immigrant named Marcus Garvey, who was building something the Harlem Renaissance's poets and painters were not. An actual mass political movement with its own flag, its own shipping company, and millions of followers across the globe. And it would draw the personal, obsessive attention of a young Justice Department official who was about to make Garvey his very first major target. His name was J. Edgar Hoover, and part 4 is where his war with Harlem truly begins. They thought a black population, however large, however concentrated, could never organize itself into a genuine political and economic force capable of operating on an international scale. They believed black ambition, left alone, would stay local, symbolic, easy to monitor, and easier to dismiss. In August of 1920, 25,000 people proved them wrong on Lenox Avenue, marching for hours in full regalia, uniformed nurses, mounted cavalry, a marching band, and delegates who had traveled from 25 countries across the Americas, the Caribbean, and Africa, all of it organized by a Jamaican immigrant who had arrived in Harlem 4 years earlier with almost nothing. His name was Marcus Garvey, and the man he frightened most was not a rival black leader, and not a Harlem landlord. It was a 25-year-old Justice Department lawyer named J. Edgar Hoover, who would spend years of his career and the earliest resources of what became the FBI trying to destroy him. When we left off, Harlem's Renaissance had produced poetry quoted by a future British Prime Minister and a jazz sound that would define American music for a generation. But poetry and jazz were not the only things Harlem was producing in the 1920s. It was also producing organized political power on a scale the United States government had never had to reckon with inside a black community before. And this is where our story turns from cultural triumph to direct, sustained confrontation with federal authority. Let's start with Garvey himself, because his ideas deserve to be understood on their own terms before we get to the government's reaction to them. Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA, in Jamaica in 1914, and brought it to Harlem in 1916, where it found exactly the density of population and ambition it needed to grow explosively. His argument was direct and, for the time, radical in its confidence. Black people, he insisted, did not need to wait for white America to grant them equality, piece by piece, permission by permission. They needed to build independent economic and political power of their own, and ultimately, in Garvey's own vision, to reclaim Africa itself as a sovereign homeland for the global black diaspora. By 1920, the UNIA claimed millions of members and sympathizers across the United States, the Caribbean, and Africa, and whatever the exact number truly was, and historians still debate it, there is no serious argument that it was small. That August, delegates converged on Harlem for a full month of convention activities, culminating in a rally at Madison Square Garden and that 25,000-person parade up Lenox Avenue. Garvey riding at its head in a plumed hat and military-style uniform, addressing crowds not as a local reverend or a neighborhood organizer, but as the self-declared provisional president of Africa. And then there was the Black Star Line, which is where Garvey's vision took its most concrete and ultimately most dangerous form. In 1919, Garvey launched a shipping company, selling shares directly to ordinary black Americans, $5 a share, marketed explicitly as a vehicle for black economic independence, and eventual transatlantic trade and travel with Africa. For thousands of working people, sharecroppers, domestic workers, laundresses like Odessa from Part 1, buying a share in the Black Star Line was not simply an investment. It was a tangible piece of a dream that had, until that point, existed only in speeches. The company purchased several aging ships, and it is worth being honest here, because the documentary record is clear on this point. The ships were in poor condition, the company's finances were disorganized, and Garvey's own management decisions were, at best, wildly overambitious for a shipping company financed largely through small donations from people who could not afford to lose the money. The Black Star Line was floundering financially well before the federal government ever touched it directly. It is also worth being honest that Garvey did not speak for a unified Harlem, even among the era's most prominent black leaders. W.E.B. Du Bois, the same scholar whose caution about white patronage shaped the literary debates of Part 3, was one of Garvey's fiercest public critics, dismissing his Back to Africa vision as impractical and criticizing the Black Star Line's finances in print well before federal prosecutors ever brought a case. The two men traded public insults for years, Garvey calling Du Bois a tool of white liberal interests, Du Bois calling Garvey's movement a dangerous fantasy dressed up in ceremonial uniforms. That rivalry matters here because it shows that Harlem's black leadership was every bit as capable of internal disagreement and rigorous public debate as any political establishment in Washington, even as outside observers, including the federal government, often preferred to treat Black Harlem as a single monolithic threat, rather than the genuinely divided, argumentative political landscape it actually was. But floundering was not the same as criminal, and this is exactly the distinction the Justice Department chose to blur. Let's talk about Hoover, because his pursuit of Garvey is, by his own department's later admission, one of the founding case studies in the federal government's long history of treating black political organizing as a security threat rather than a legitimate movement. In 1919, still working within the Bureau of Investigation's General Intelligence Division, Hoover assigned agents, including one of the Bureau's first black agents, a man named James Wormley Jones, to infiltrate UNIA meetings and monitor Garvey's mail from the inside. Jones spent months embedded in the organization, filing detailed reports back to Washington on Garvey's finances, his speeches, and his private conversations, the kind of intimate access no outside observer could have obtained. In an internal memo that would later become notorious among historians, Hoover complained that Garvey had, in his words, not yet violated any federal law that would make him deportable, and openly discussed finding grounds to prosecute him anyway. That is worth sitting with. The nation's future top law enforcement official was not investigating a suspected crime. He was hunting for a legal justification to remove a man whose actual offense, in the government's eyes, appears to have been organizing black people at a scale no one in Washington had a comfortable precedent for handling. Eventually, Hoover's investigators found their opening in the Black Star Line's chaotic finances. In 1922, Garvey was indicted for mail fraud, tied to promotional materials the government argued had misled investors about the company's ships and finances. He was convicted in 1923 in a trial where Garvey, controversially, chose to represent himself for much of the proceedings after dismissing his attorney, a decision many observers at the time considered a serious tactical mistake, given that he was a gifted orator but had no legal training and repeatedly clashed with the judge over courtroom procedure. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, a term that struck even some of his harshest critics as disproportionate to the actual financial harm the prosecution had documented. He served roughly 2 years at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta before President Calvin Coolidge commuted his sentence in 1927 on the condition of immediate deportation. Garvey left the United States and never returned, continuing to organize from Jamaica and later London until his death in 1940, his movement never regaining the scale it had reached that August afternoon on Lenox Avenue in 1920. Whether the underlying fraud charges reflected genuine, provable criminal intent, or the desperate mismanagement of an underfunded, overambitious company run by true believers remains a subject of real historical debate. What is not in serious dispute is the origin of the investigation itself, and the plain fact that a movement capable of filling Madison Square Garden and marching 25,000 people up Lenox Avenue had become, in the eyes of a young federal official who would go on to run the FBI for nearly 5 decades, a problem requiring the full resources of the United States government to dismantle. Garvey was not Harlem's only radical, and it would be a mistake to treat him as though he spoke for the entire neighborhood, because Harlem, as we have seen throughout this series, was never one voice. Consider A. Philip Randolph, the same editor from Part 2, whose newspaper, The Messenger, had already earned its own Justice Department file. Randolph rejected Garvey's Back to Africa vision almost entirely, arguing instead that Black Americans' path to power ran through organized labor, built inside the American economy, rather than departing from it. In 1925, Randolph began organizing porters working for the Pullman Company, the men who staffed the sleeping cars on America's passenger trains, into what became the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first black labor union to win a contract with a major American corporation. This was, by design, an unglamorous fight, and it is worth understanding exactly how unglamorous, because it stands in deliberate contrast to Garvey's parades and Hoover's headline-grabbing prosecution. Pullman was, at the time, the single largest employer of black men in the entire country, and it treated its porters, many of them college-educated, as interchangeable servants, addressing grown men collectively as George, after the company's founder, regardless of their actual names, and paying wages so low that porters depended almost entirely on tips to survive. Randolph spent more than a decade building support for the union, porter by porter, train by train, facing constant harassment and firings organized by Pullman itself, and facing skepticism even within Harlem from those who doubted an all-black union could ever force a concession out of one of the largest corporations in America. It took 12 years of patient, often invisible organizing before Pullman finally recognized the Brotherhood in 1937, becoming the first labor contract any American company had ever signed with a black union. It was a slower, less theatrical kind of power than Garvey's parades, but it proved a second path existed alongside his, one running not through Africa, but directly through the American labor movement itself, and it would make Randolph one of the most significant black organizers of the 20th century, eventually standing beside Martin Luther King Jr. decades later as one of the chief architects of the March on Washington. By the late 1920s then, understand what federal and city authorities were now watching in a single Manhattan neighborhood, a mass movement with international reach and its own shipping line, dismantled through prosecution and deportation. A radical press already under surveillance since the previous decade. A labor organizer building slow, patient power inside the country's rail system. And running through all of it, the churches from Part 2, several of which hosted Garvey's rallies, Randolph's organizing meetings, and radical speakers of every stripe, which is precisely why the NYPD had, by this point, assigned officers specifically to monitor sermons and public meetings across Harlem's largest congregations, treating black religious gathering itself as a category of activity worth watching. Here's the pattern to hold on to as we move into Part 5, because it explains everything Harlem was about to face next. Every single institution this series has described, the money, the press, the church, the archive, the art, the political organizing, had been built by a population that arrived with almost nothing, and was, in most cases, still earning less than white New Yorkers doing the exact same jobs, still paying more in rent for worse housing than white tenants downtown, still locked out of most of the city's best-paying industries entirely. Harlem's cultural and political triumphs of the 1920s had been built, quite literally, on top of deep and unresolved economic fragility. And in October of 1929, the American economy collapsed entirely. What happened next in Harlem when the Great Depression hit a community already stretched to its absolute limit, and when years of federal surveillance, economic exclusion, and simple accumulated exhaustion finally reached their breaking point, is where we go in Part 5. It begins on a March afternoon in 1935 with a rumor about a boy in a store on 125th Street. A rumor that was false, and a neighborhood that, after everything you have just watched it build, had finally run out of patience. They thought a neighborhood already stretched to its breaking point by unemployment, eviction, and a decade of federal surveillance would simply keep absorbing it, quietly, the way it always had. On the afternoon of March 19, 1935, a false rumor about a teenage boy inside a five and dime store on 125th Street proved them wrong within a matter of hours, and by the time the sun came up the next morning, 3 people were dead, hundreds were injured, and the plate glass windows of nearly every white-owned business on Harlem's main commercial strip lay shattered across the sidewalk. What happened that night was not, as many downtown newspapers rushed to describe it, senseless. It was the precise, predictable result of everything this series has already shown you being built on a foundation that had never been financially secure to begin with. When we left off, Harlem had spent 15 years assembling extraordinary cultural and political power. Madam Walker's fortune, a fearless press, mass movements, and a slow-building labor union, while the great majority of the people living there remained locked out of the city's best-paying jobs, still paying inflated rents for substandard housing, still last hired and first fired in every industry that would hire them at all. In October of 1929, the American stock market collapsed, and the Great Depression that followed did not strike Harlem the same way it struck the rest of the country. It struck harder, faster, and it stayed longer. Let's be precise about the numbers, because they explain everything that follows. By the early 1930s, unemployment among black workers in Harlem is estimated to have run as high as 50%, roughly double the rate for the city as a whole. And Harlem residents were already paying, on average, a significantly higher share of their income toward rent than white New Yorkers in comparable housing, a pattern this series traced all the way back to Odessa's arrival in Part 1. This was not simply bad luck. It was the direct result of exclusion built into the structure of the job market itself. Skilled trade unions across the city, in construction, in manufacturing, in the emerging civil service, routinely barred black membership outright or relegated black workers to the lowest paid, least secure positions available, so that even relief programs created specifically to put people back to work, like the federally funded Works Progress Administration projects that began arriving in New York later in the decade, often channeled black applicants disproportionately into unskilled labor regardless of their actual training or experience. When the Depression hit, that math simply stopped working. Evictions became a daily, visible feature of Harlem street life, marshals arriving to pile a family's furniture, mattresses, and dishes onto the sidewalk, while neighbors watched from stoops and windows. But Harlem did not simply watch its neighbors get evicted without resistance, and this is where the Communist Party enters the story in a way it had not before. Through the early 1930s, the party organized what became known as unemployed councils across Harlem, and these councils developed a direct, almost theatrical tactic in response to evictions. When a marshal set a family's belongings out on the curb, organizers and neighbors would simply carry the furniture back inside the apartment, sometimes within minutes, daring the authorities to remove it all over again in front of a growing crowd. These actions, sometimes called furniture brigades, made the Communist Party a genuinely significant presence in Harlem by the mid-1930s, not because most of Harlem's residents embraced communism as an ideology, but because the party was one of the only organizations in New York City showing up, in person, at the exact moment families needed someone to show up. Alongside the eviction fights, a second campaign was reshaping Harlem's relationship to its own main commercial street. Along 125th Street, the retail corridor at the heart of the neighborhood, most of the stores were white-owned, and the great majority of them refused to hire black employees, even as they depended entirely on black customers for their revenue. In response, a coalition of Harlem ministers, activists, and eventually more radical organizers launched what became known as the "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaign, picketing stores that took black money at the register while refusing to put a single black face behind the counter. Some store owners relented under the pressure of boycotts and picket lines. Many did not, and the resentment over 100 25th Street stores, resentment that had been building for years before March of 1935, is essential to understanding what happened next, because the spark, when it finally came from inside one of those very stores. Let's walk through that afternoon carefully, because the actual sequence of events matters, and it was almost entirely built on a lie no one had time to correct before it detonated. The Crest store on 125th Street where it began was not a random location. It was one of the chain stores the "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaign had specifically targeted for years, a business that took in enormous daily revenue from black customers, while its clerks, cashiers, and floor staff remained almost entirely white. Exactly the pattern of exclusion this series described a few minutes ago. That history was already sitting in the memory of everyone standing outside that store well before the events of that particular afternoon began. On March 19, 1935, a 16-year-old boy named Lino Rivera, a Puerto Rican teenager, was caught shoplifting a small penknife from the store. Store employees caught him, and in the scuffle that followed, he reportedly bit one of them. Police were called, and rather than arrest him on the spot in front of the gathering crowd outside, an officer quietly released Rivera through a back entrance to avoid provoking a scene, a decision that, in the moment, seemed to diffuse the situation. It did the opposite. A crowd had already gathered outside the front of the store, having watched police and store employees hustle a black or Puerto Rican teenager into a back room, and when Rivera did not reappear out front, a rumor began spreading through the crowd, then through the neighborhood, that the boy had been beaten to death by police inside the store. It was completely false. Rivera was already back home with his family, entirely unharmed. But by the time anyone in a position of authority tried to correct the record, the rumor had already done its work on a population that had spent 5 years watching its furniture thrown onto sidewalks, and its storefronts refused to hire its own neighbors. By nightfall, thousands of people filled the streets around 125th Street. A hearse, coincidentally parked nearby for an unrelated reason, was spotted by the crowd and taken as physical proof that the rumor was true, that a body had in fact been removed from the store. What followed was hours of rioting, concentrated almost entirely on property rather than people. Windows smashed along 125th Street, storefronts looted, largely targeting exactly the white-owned businesses the "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaign had spent years picketing. By the time the violence subsided, 3 people had died, roughly 200 were injured, and property damage across the corridor ran into the millions of dollars, a staggering sum for the middle of the Depression. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia's response to the riot is itself a significant part of this story, because rather than simply treating it as criminal disorder to be punished, LaGuardia appointed a formal commission to investigate its actual causes, a decision that was, for a sitting mayor in 1935, genuinely unusual. Most municipal responses to urban unrest in this era began and ended with police reports and arrest counts, and Harlem did see plenty of both. More than 100 people were arrested in the aftermath, and additional police were deployed throughout the neighborhood for weeks afterward. But LaGuardia, who had built a reputation as a reformer willing to challenge entrenched interests, chose instead to commission an actual investigation into root causes, appointing a commission that included the sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, whose research on black family and urban life would shape decades of scholarship. And in a direct callback to the Renaissance, this series covered in Part 3, the poet Countee Cullen, whose verse had helped define the New Negro movement a decade earlier, and now sat on a municipal panel investigating why that same neighborhood had erupted in violence. The commission's findings, when they were finally compiled, explicitly rejected the idea that the riot had been caused by outside agitators or communist manipulation, a claim several downtown newspapers had rushed to make in the immediate aftermath, eager to paint the violence as the work of imported radicals rather than a response to conditions inside Harlem itself. Instead, the report placed the blame squarely on decades of employment, discrimination, housing exploitation, and abusive policing. Essentially the same structural conditions this documentary series has traced from Odessa's arrival in Part 1 straight through to that afternoon on 125th Street. It documented in specific and damning detail the exact hiring discrimination the Don't Buy, Where You Can't Work campaign had been protesting for years, along with substandard housing conditions and a pattern of police conduct toward Harlem residents that the commission described as needlessly hostile. It was one of the first official government documents in American history to state, in plain administrative language, that a riot in a black community had been caused not by the community itself, but by the systematic exclusion imposed on it from the outside. LaGuardia, notably, never released the commission's full report to the public himself, reportedly wary of its political implications, and it was ultimately a black newspaper, the Amsterdam News, the same paper first introduced back in Part 2 of this series, that obtained and published the findings in full, ensuring Harlem's own account of what had happened to it, and why, could not simply be buried in a city hall filing cabinet. The 1935 riot did not end Harlem's story, and it certainly did not end its status as the capital this entire series has traced into existence. But it marked a turning point, the moment the neighborhood's own internal contradictions, extraordinary cultural power built on top of grinding economic exclusion, finally became impossible for the rest of the city to ignore or explain away. It would not be the last time those contradictions boiled over either. 8 years later, in the summer of 1943, with the country now at war and Harlem's young men serving in a still segregated military, while facing many of the same conditions documented by LaGuardia's commission back home, another rumor, this time involving a black soldier and a white police officer, would ignite an almost identical eruption along the same streets, a sign that the underlying conditions identified in 1935 had never actually been resolved, only interrupted. In Part 6, the final chapter of this story, we follow Harlem through that second riot in 1943, through the decades of population shifts, disinvestment, and renewed struggle that followed the Second World War, and into the second half of the 20th century, when the very qualities that made Harlem a capital, its density, its concentration of black political and cultural power, would be tested by forces far larger than any single mayor's commission. We will close this series by answering the question it has been building toward from the very first frame. Does Harlem remain the capital of Black America today? Or did that title belong to a specific moment in time that has already passed? They thought that once the parade stopped marching and the poetry stopped making headlines, Harlem's moment would simply pass. A vivid but temporary chapter in American history destined to fade the way most neighborhoods eventually fade, back into ordinary obscurity. Nearly a century after Odessa first stepped off that train in Savannah, we can finally answer whether they were right. And the honest answer is not a simple yes or no. It sits somewhere between a landmark church that still fills every pew on a Sunday morning and a rent bill that many of the families whose grandparents built this neighborhood can no longer afford to pay. When we left off, Harlem had just endured the 1935 riot, and Mayor LaGuardia's own commission had confirmed, in writing, that the violence was rooted in real and unresolved discrimination in jobs, housing, and policing. That confirmation changed remarkably little in practice. 8 years later, in the summer of 1943, with the United States now fighting a war against fascism abroad while maintaining a segregated military and a segregated home front, the same underlying tensions detonated again, and this time the spark came from a story that captured the war's central hypocrisy almost too perfectly to be believed. On the evening of August 1st, 1943, a black soldier named Robert Bandy intervened in an altercation at the Braddock Hotel involving a black woman and hotel staff. A white police officer, responding to the disturbance, ended up shooting Bandy, wounding him in the shoulder. Bandy survived, but by the time the story spread through the neighborhood that night, it had transformed, exactly as the Rivera rumor had 8 years earlier, into something far more inflammatory: that a black soldier in uniform, home on leave, had been killed by a white police officer in Harlem. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most influential black newspapers in the country, had spent the war years promoting what it called the Double V campaign: victory over fascism overseas and victory over racism at home. And the rumor of a black soldier gunned down by police landed directly on top of that argument's rawest nerve. Rioting broke out across Harlem that night. 6 people were killed, hundreds injured, and property damage across the neighborhood ran even higher than in 1935. Once again, the violence concentrated almost entirely on property, looting, and destruction along the same commercial corridors that had never fully recovered from the first riot. A pattern that should, by this point in the story, feel less like coincidence and more like a diagnosis repeating itself because the underlying illness had never actually been treated. The years following the Second World War brought a slower, quieter kind of transformation, and in some ways a more consequential one, because it happened without a single dramatic night anyone could point to. Federal housing policy through the 1940s and 1950s, most notoriously the practice of redlining, in which government-backed mortgage maps literally outlined black neighborhoods in red ink to mark them as poor credit risks, made it nearly impossible for Harlem residents to secure the same home loans that were fueling a suburban housing boom for white families across the rest of the country. The Federal Housing Administration, whose loan guarantees underwrote millions of the era's new suburban homes, applied underwriting standards that explicitly treated the presence of black residents, or even racial mixing itself, as a mark against a neighborhood's investment value. A policy embedded in the very appraisal manuals federal officials distributed to lenders nationwide. As some black professionals and skilled workers did manage to move to newer housing in Queens, in parts of the Bronx, and eventually the suburbs, the disinvestment in Harlem itself accelerated. Landlords, facing a shrinking pool of tenants who could afford market rent and a lending environment that made renovation loans difficult to obtain, increasingly let their buildings deteriorate rather than invest in them. By the 1960s and into the 1970s, this slow abandonment had produced a visible crisis: entire blocks of buildings sitting empty or burned, some landlords accused of arson for insurance payouts rather than continued, unprofitable ownership. And yet, even as the physical neighborhood eroded, Harlem's political and cultural weight did not simply vanish. And this is the contradiction that defines the rest of the 20th century for this neighborhood. Consider Malcolm X, who established his base at Mosque No. 7 on Lenox Avenue in the 1950s, and built it into one of the most significant platforms for black political thought in the entire country. Drawing the same kind of federal surveillance this series has already documented for Garvey decades earlier, the FBI maintaining an enormous file on his activities throughout his time there, tracking his sermons and speeches with the same institutional anxiety Hoover had once directed at Garvey's parades. Consider Adam Clayton Powell Jr., whom this series first met as a boy watching his father build Abyssinian Baptist Church in Part 2, now representing Harlem in the United States Congress and rising to chair the powerful House Education and Labor Committee, using that position to advance civil rights legislation that would have been unimaginable for a black congressman a generation earlier, and turning the same pulpit his father had built into a launching pad for federal political power in a way that would have seemed impossible to the members of that DOJ intelligence unit watching Harlem's churches back in Part 4. Harlem also endured yet another riot in 1964, again triggered by a police shooting, this time of a black teenager named James Powell, a sign that the pattern first documented by LaGuardia's commission in 1935 had still not been resolved even 3 decades later. By the 1970s and into the 1980s, Harlem faced perhaps its most severe crisis yet, as heroin and later crack cocaine devastated the neighborhood, feeding both addiction and a surge in violent crime that made national headlines, often in ways that flattened the neighborhood's history into a single, simplistic story of urban decay, ignoring almost entirely the deliberate policy decisions, redlining, disinvestment, and decades of unequal enforcement that had produced the crisis in the first place. Population that had once exceeded 200,000 in a 3-square-mile footprint declined sharply during these decades, as those with the means to leave increasingly did, leaving behind a poorer, more isolated community. Even as the neighborhood's historic institutions, Abyssinian Baptist Church, the Apollo Theater, the Schomburg Center, continued operating, sometimes barely, as physical anchors of a legacy that refused to fully disappear even at the neighborhood's lowest point. The turn came gradually, beginning in the 1990s, as falling crime rates across New York City, renewed interest in historic brownstone housing stock, and targeted redevelopment initiatives, including a much-publicized decision by former President Bill Clinton to locate his post-presidential office on 125th Street in 2001, brought new investment, new residents, and new attention back to Harlem. Developers who had ignored these same brownstones for decades suddenly recognized what Philip Payton had understood back in part 1 of this series, that Harlem's housing stock was fundamentally excellent, wide, well-built, architecturally significant, and that its market value had been suppressed for generations, not by anything inherent to the buildings themselves, but by exactly the redlining and disinvestment policies this documentary has just described. This has produced what many people simply call gentrification, and it deserves an honest accounting rather than a simple celebration, because it carries the same central tension this series has traced from its very first minutes. Property values and rents in Harlem have risen dramatically over the past 2 decades, and many longtime Black residents and their descendants, the very families whose grandparents and great-grandparents built the institutions this documentary has spent 6 parts describing, have been priced out of the neighborhood entirely, moving to the Bronx, to New Jersey, to the same kind of search for affordable housing and opportunity that first brought their ancestors north during the Great Migration a century earlier. Harlem's Black population share, which once made it one of the most concentrated Black communities in the entire country, has declined significantly since the 1990s, even as the neighborhood's absolute population has grown. So we return to the question this series set out to answer. Does Harlem remain the capital of Black America today, or did that title belong to a specific moment in time that has already passed? The honest answer is that both things are true at once, and that discomfort is itself the most important thing to understand about this neighborhood's legacy. The institutions endure. Abyssinian Baptist Church still holds services in the same sanctuary Adam Clayton Powell Sr. built in 1923. The Apollo Theater still hosts live performances on the same stage where a young Ella Fitzgerald once won an amateur night contest. The Schomburg Center still holds Arturo Schomburg's original collection, expanded now into one of the most significant archives of Black history and culture anywhere in the world. Every February, Black History Month draws visitors from around the globe specifically to walk these same streets, because the density of significance packed into this 3-square-mile footprint remains, in a literal physical sense, unmatched anywhere else in the country. In that sense, the people who believed Black Americans could never build something permanent, something the rest of the country would eventually have to travel to and reckon with on its own terms, were simply, historically, wrong, and the buildings still standing on 125th and 138th Street are the proof. But permanence of institution is not the same as permanence of population, and a neighborhood's history belongs, in the end, to the people living inside it, not only to the landmarks they leave behind. Harlem today is more racially mixed than at any point since Philip Payton first began filling those empty brownstones back in Part 1, and many of the descendants of the families who built this neighborhood's churches, newspapers, and businesses now live scattered across the wider metropolitan region, the same geography of dispersal. The Great Migration was originally organized to escape. Whether that represents a story's natural, even healthy evolution, or a slower, more polite version of the same displacement this series has documented since 1904, is a question historians, and the people who still call Harlem home today, continue to argue about, much the way Du Bois and Garvey argued, much the way Hughes and Van Vechten argued, because if this series has shown anything, it is that Harlem has never once been a single, unified voice offering a single, simple answer. What is certain is this. In the spring of 1917, a woman named Odessa stood on a train platform in Savannah, Georgia, holding a cardboard suitcase and a rumor she could not confirm, betting everything on the idea that somewhere north of the Mason-Dixon line, Black Americans could build something of their own. A century later, whatever you believe the correct answer to this series' central question actually is, one fact remains beyond argument. They built it. Whether the world was ready for it or not, whether the FBI approved of it or not, whether it survives in its original form or continues transforming into whatever comes next, Harlem stands still as proof of exactly what a people written off as incapable of building anything of lasting value can accomplish when they are finally given 3 square miles of room to try.